Hi everyone, it's Rick Beato. In today's Everything Music, we're going to talk about how to practice your instrument. That's how to organize your practicing sessions and how to learn and retain as much information as quickly as possible. That's coming up next. Okay, practicing. It's something that everybody should do. We don't always have enough time to do it, but being organized with your practicing is extremely important. Now, I have some concepts that I've gravitated towards with my practicing and as a teacher with teaching people how to practice, because it's really important. The main thing that I always would tell students is don't practice what you know, practice what you don't know. You always want to keep learning new things, whether it's new scales, new arpeggios, new melodic patterns, new repertoire. What I like to begin with each day is technique. Now, what is technique? Well, technique is not only the dexterity of your fingers playing a horn or whatever it is, your articulations, it can be anything. There's many aspects of technique and it really changes from instrument to instrument. Now, let's say that we take the piano. As a beginning pianist, many people would practice things like Hanon. Essentially take scale. We'll go through a series of exercises with both hands. There's 32 Hanon etudes, 31 or 32. I think there's 31. If you're well beyond Hanon, which many of you will be, then I would start working on things like all the different scales. I would start out and I would practice C major, G major, D major, A major, E major, B major, F sharp major, and then D flat major, A flat, E flat, B flat, F, and go right around the circle of fifths. And then I'd go the opposite way. C, F, B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, and so on and so forth. The other way to practice things is chromatically. Now on the piano, chromatically is very difficult. So I would do a C major, C sharp major, D major, E major. So I practice them both ways. I'd probably alternate them on particular days. Then I would have an arpeggio routine. I would create whatever instrument you're on, I would create some type of arpeggio idea, whether it's practicing with both hands, or whether it's practicing with one hand. And I would not only do that, practice them both hands, then I would practice them in different patterns. I would practice them in broken arpeggios. I would practice them in odd groupings. That would be a pattern in fives. I practice them in triplets. I might do them in... Then I'd practice them. And then I would practice them whatever new way that you don't have mastered. Practice with both hands separately and together. After that, once you have them all mastered, then I would get into things like polytonal arpeggios. So that would be where you're doing C major and F sharp major, for example. So I could do F sharp. Things that you wouldn't normally think of. You know, you might be doing G major and A major. Okay, those would be polytonal arpeggios. They could be with multiple seventh chords. It could... Okay, and go up through multiple octaves with these. Write them down and keep a running log of what you're practicing. After you've done your scales and arpeggios, then I would get into linear studies. Okay, now linear studies can be certain scale patterns. It might be things that you would find in Hanon, but I would practice them in other scales. Let's say you take a C altered scale, and I would play. And I'd go through all the arpeggios in the scale, all the way through in both hands, separately and simultaneously. And I would do it multiple metronome markings. I usually like to divide my practice time up with my technique being at least 15 to 30 minutes. That's going to give you a really strong basis to keep your chops together and keep your finger dexterity and coordination up to the level it needs to be. Now, let me talk about particular practicing techniques. Okay, there's a technique called additive practice that is great for practicing scales. And this is how it works. Okay, so if I were to do a C major scale using this additive technique, I would go like this. You always want to return back to the first note, and then I'd go to the first 3 notes. Return back to home. Then add a note again. So now I'm going to add the 6th note. And the 7th note. Then I'm going to add the octave. Next thing is talking about repetition. Now, repetition is really the key to learning. I remember reading one time that Horowitz, Vladimir Horowitz, would repeat the same phrase 120 times correctly till he felt like he had it really under his fingers. Typically for children, they say 3 times, for a young child, 3 times of repetition without a mistake would lock it into the brain. As you get a little bit older, your kids get 6 to 8 years old or so, then it's about 8 times. For myself, I'd want to be able to play it 20 times without a mistake. At that point, I would feel that it would be ingrained enough where I would never have any errors during any other repetitions. That is going to give your playing the kind of accuracy that you need for things like playing in a concert hall, playing in a studio. You'd be surprised at how few people can come in and play a take all the way through a piece, even if it's a very simple part. Rarely happens, and it's really because people don't have the focus to do it. The next thing I would do is move to repertoire. Now, your repertoire is the pieces that you're working on. If you're a classical musician and you're working on a Beethoven piano sonata, I would work on that in whatever sections you're working on. And I would, if you're learning the piece, you want to learn it in sections. You want to do analysis of it. Okay, analysis is a big part of practice when you're learning a new piece. If there are certain harmonic progressions that will help you grab a hold of memorizing the piece, those are the things you want to focus on. When I'm learning a new piece, a classical piece, I am constantly looking at, okay, what are the chord progressions here? What is the harmonic movement? Because in addition to understanding phrasing and articulation, you need to also understand what the movement is melodically and harmonically. After repertoire, I would move to ear training. Now, ear training is something that you need to do every single practice session, even if it's just for a few minutes. Now, the ear training can simply be bum, bum, where I'm singing the interval and I'm singing a minor 7th, okay? It could be where I'm identifying a chord. Oh, that's a Lydian augmented chord, D flat Lydian augmented, okay? Or it can be dictation, such as transcribing a solo or a piece. And I would spend a lot of time on that because there's nothing better to solidify intervals in your head than not only hearing them and learning them on your instrument, but writing it down. Transcribing solos or transcribing pieces is incredibly helpful for your arranging skills, for your transcription skills, for your ear training skills, for learning how to play what you hear, for learning how to know what you're hearing. And I mean, if you hear a piece, for example, I do these film scoring analysis of film scores on here. I've done Thomas Newman, I've done John Williams, and I'm going to do many more. Most of these film scores are not available by score. John Williams, you can find the scores to his films, but you can't find Thomas Newman or James Newton Howard. You just can't find them. So what do? You have to actually transcribe them. So you have to listen to them and say, I hear this instrument, I hear that instrument. And some of the stuff is actually figuring out how they're orchestrated, where the divises are, what sections are playing what notes you're hearing. I would actually work on transcribing things like film scores for myself, for example. I used to do jazz solos. I used to do a lot of jazz solos of jazz guitar. I'm a guitarist. I would transcribe jazz guitar solos. I would do Wes Montgomery solos. I would do Charlie Christian. I do Grant Green. I do Django Reinhardt. I do Pat Metheny. I would do John Abercrombie and John Scofield and Joe Pass. I would do all these guys when I was growing up. I would sit down with a piece of paper, except I would transcribe solos for 6 hours. That would be part of my practice routine. I would practice, when it was the summertime of college, I would practice 10 hours a day. Now, a lot of you say, wow, 10 hours, that is insane. Well, it wouldn't be all practicing. I wouldn't be working on scales. You'd end up getting tendinitis, or even working on pieces. You don't want to be practicing the same piece for 8 hours. But if I would break my practice time up in, just like I'm saying here, technique, scales, arpeggios, and then new melodic ideas, linear ideas. Then I would do repertoire, okay, and I would work on new pieces, then old pieces, and then I would work on, whether it's solos or if I'm working on a series of pieces for a recital. If I'm going to do a piano recital, and my piano recital is going to range from playing a Bach fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier to a Beethoven piano sonata to a Prokofiev piano sonata. If I'm mixing these different styles, and there's certain types of study that you want to do of idiomatic phrasing and dynamics. For example, in the Baroque era, they used what they called terraced dynamics, meaning they would be piano or forte. I mean, you wouldn't have all the subtlety because we don't really know to a high degree, because they wouldn't include these markings in music from the Baroque era, for example. So you have to understand what people were doing stylistically in that period, which leads me to the next area of practice, which is music history. This is something that people leave out because they don't even think about it. Understanding the lineage of your instrument, as well as understanding the stylistic elements of each style period, if you're a classical musician or if you're a jazz musician, understanding what Charlie Parker played versus what John Coltrane played versus what Miles Davis played and then Michael Brecker played. So this having the knowledge of the lineage of your instrument and of all instruments through all style periods in the genre of music that you're in and other genres of music is extremely important and should be studied daily. I started out as a classical musician and learned classical music, and then I learned jazz, and then I learned pop at the same time, pop and rock. So my background in music was really varied. I had the benefit of studying music theory from a classical composing point of view when I was an undergrad, and then I studied jazz studies in my master's degree. Even if you're a classical musician, understanding other genres of music is extremely important, especially if you're a film composer. Now, when you listen to a soundtrack of John Williams, he's an experienced jazz pianist. So when he needs to write a cue that is oriented more towards jazz, or if he's doing something that is neo-romantic, or if he's doing something that's more, modern, atonal, 20th century, he can do all those because he understands all those genres of music. And to really be the best at those, nowadays you have to understand electronic music. You have to know how to use loops. You have to know how to use the big music instrument libraries. For example, and I'll talk about this in some of my other videos, some of the ranges that you hear that are used. Like, I'll hear pieces where the basses will be going down below E, going down to low D flat, for example, or low D. And unless you have an extension on your bass, on your upright bass, they have extenders where they flip and it will extend the pitch down and you can play much lower notes. But most people don't realize that this low E right here is the lowest note that an upright double bass will play. So they will write things down lower than that, not realizing that they can't even be played. So it's really important as a film composer to understand as many genres, including electronic music and modern pop music and modern rock music, so that you can write any cue that you're asked to. The next thing is learning about theory. Okay, that's the next part of your music practicing. And that could mean studying scores. That could mean studying things like bitonalism or polytonalism or altered chords, or whatever it may be that you don't have a firm grasp on, and understanding if you don't know that all the triads that are in a C melodic minor scale, or what the altered notes are, if I play a chord like this, okay, so I play that chord, that's an F sharp major over C major. Now that either comes from the C altered dominant scale or the C dominant diminished scale. But what are those alterations on there? Well, the F sharp is the sharp 4 or the flat 5. The A sharp, which is B flat, is the flat 7, and the C sharp is the flat 9. So it's really a flat 5, flat 9 sound. Anytime you have a chord that is a tritone away from the bass note, a major triad, a tritone away, it's going to give you the flat 5, the flat 7, and the flat 9. These are the kind of things that you learn in your theory study. This is really important to understanding and being able to teach these things. Well, not just teach them, to be able to grab these things on the fly. Thing is sight reading. Now, a lot of people don't practice enough sight reading. Sight reading can be sight singing as well. It's all the same. But you always want to incorporate sight reading in your practice. Usually the sight reading will go either at the beginning of practice or at the end of practice. When I'm teaching my kids, we would do sight reading usually at the end, because it can be really taxing, and I want that to be the last thing that they're doing. Sometimes, if they really need work on it, we'll do it right at the beginning after the scales and arpeggios. I will get right to sight reading and incorporate that early in practice. How you do these things is not as important, except for the technical part of it. You always want to have a good warm-up. Technique is a great way to warm up by practicing your scales and arpeggios. With all these tips I've given you, there's a couple things that you need. You need a good notebook to keep notes in, and you need a book of staff paper, because you want to keep track of everything you're practicing so you can remember to go over it. Sometimes things that you practice will take months to incorporate in your playing, but you want to remember that you've practiced them. There may be something you practiced 6 weeks ago that you don't remember to practice for 6 months. I want to be able to go back to those and say, oh, I remember practicing that, let me work on that again. And your notebook and your music notation paper is going to help you keep track of that. Now, you can do it in your computer as well, but I like to use good old real pen and paper when I'm doing it. Please feel free to write me with any suggestions you have on your practice regimen. I'd love to hear about it. That's all for now. I'm Rick Beato.